I still remember the first time I saw the lodge. It sat deep in the winter woods, half buried in snow, the windows glowing faintly like tired eyes in the fog. My breath clouded the air as I stepped closer, the silence so thick I could hear the slow crack of ice shifting beneath the trees. The path behind me had already disappeared under falling snow, and I realized how alone I was. Every step toward the porch felt like stepping into another world, one where time was slower, heavier. The door creaked when I touched it, as if the wood itself wanted to whisper a warning. A single lantern flickered inside, casting long, sharp shadows that swayed across the walls. I thought I heard someone breathing in the dark corners of the room, but when I turned, the space was empty. The shadows stretched further than they should have, bending, reaching, curling around the furniture like living things. That's when I saw it. The outline of a man, taller than the doorway, standing perfectly still in the corner where no light should have reached. The snow was thick tonight. Each flake fell like a slow heartbeat, soft and quiet. The world around me was pale, almost empty. I walked alone. My boots sank, leaving hollow prints. Every step echoed, swallowed immediately by the fog. Then a flicker, a light. It wasn't far, but it felt impossible. A lantern, standing in the snow, burning though no hand held it. The flame danced, yet there was no warmth on my face. I knelt closer. The glow was strange, too steady, too alive. Shadows stretched out from it, but they didn't match me. They moved, twisting, bending, like people just beyond my vision. I leaned in, breath clouding. There was a hum, soft and low, a vibration under the snow, under the air itself. It whispered, I should have stepped back. But curiosity pressed my feet forward. The lantern seemed to pulse, guiding me, pulling me deeper into the fog. The air changed. It smelled of cold wood, wet moss, something faintly iron-like. My ears caught rustling, soft, deliberate, though no wind stirred. And then I saw it. A cabin. Not on any map I knew. Not marked on the forest paths. Its windows glowed faintly, like eyes half closed in sleep. The snow around it was undisturbed except for my own trail. The lantern hovered between me and the cabin. Flicker. Pause. Flicker. It seemed alive, waiting. I stepped forward. Soft crunches followed me, though I was certain I was alone. The fog curled around my legs, damp and whispering. A shadow slipped past the cabin's corner. I stopped. It didn't linger. I didn't move. The door was cracked open. Inside smelled of pine and ash. The pale light of the lantern spilled across the threshold. It showed nothing. Empty chairs, a table dusted with frost, walls that seemed too tall. And yet, the shadows moved inside, sliding along the wood like liquid. I wanted to leave, but my feet didn't listen. I wanted warmth, or company, or something real. The lantern's glow pressed me onward. A window rattled. I flinched, but the cabin made no other sound. No wind, no footsteps, nothing but the subtle hum of the light. I traced the edges of the table. My fingers brushed the cold wood. A shiver ran through me, and then, reflection. Not mine. Someone, or something, was behind me. Tall, pale, silent. I blinked. Gone. The lantern flickered, as if amused. I crouched, breathing shallow. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The fog thickened, curling around the cabin in slow, deliberate waves. It smelled different now, metallic, faintly sweet, like snow melting over old iron. I followed the lantern past the doorway. It floated just ahead, never more than a few steps away. The shadows lengthened, reaching for me, then retreating. I could hear soft footsteps behind me, or maybe just my own. The cabin seemed endless, Walls twisted in impossible ways, ceilings too high, corners too dark. The lantern's flame pulsed, gentle, hypnotic. I wanted to stop, close my eyes, run back to the forest, but I couldn't. Finally, I reached the edge of the clearing. The lantern flickered once more, and then it was gone. The fog swallowed it, leaving only the snow, silent and white. No cabin, no footprints but my own. I stood alone. The air was still. The hum faded. Only the rustle of my own breath remained. And somewhere, just beyond the fog, I felt eyes, watching, waiting. I moved forward, slowly, careful, because I had followed a light into a place that shouldn't exist. The snow lay thick around the lodge. Each step I took sank quietly, swallowed immediately. The trees were still, their branches heavy and low. I thought I was alone. But then, a crunch. Behind me. I froze. The snow pressed silently under my boots. And yet, something else pressed, too. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing in the snow. I turned. Nothing. The path was empty, just the pale shadows of the lodge stretching across the frozen ground. I breathed slowly, tasting the cold. My gloves felt damp from frost. Every nerve in my body stretched tight, waiting. The footsteps came again, closer this time, though no one appeared. Each crunch was soft, yet unnervingly clear, too even, too steady. I walked faster. The wind lifted faintly, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. But the sound behind me kept pace, unwavering. I glanced down. My footprints lay in neat rows ahead, but other prints followed mine. They didn't belong to me. Not in shape, not in size. They were just there, matching my pace, copying my path. The fog thickened. It clung to my legs, curling and whispering. I could feel the eyes of the forest on me, heavy and quiet. I shivered. The footprints never led, only followed. The lodge grew smaller behind me. Its windows glinted pale light as if watching. The hum of the snow beneath my boots felt louder. I stopped. The steps stopped. A hollow silence. Nothing moved, only the fog breathing around me. I turned again, still empty. Yet the prints remained, tracing me, always tracing me. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was wind, the snow shifting, imagination. But imagination doesn't leave footprints, and imagination doesn't pause when I pause. I kept walking. The cold pressed harder now, frost on my cheeks biting. My breath came out in soft, ragged clouds. The footsteps followed, never leading, always behind. I glanced over my shoulder. Shadows flickered in the trees. The lodge vanished into the fog. The footprints. They persisted. A branch snapped. I flinched, heart hammering, though no one appeared. The snow was smooth again. But when I looked down, the prints were still there. Soft, deliberate, tracing me. A mirror of my own movements. And then, a pause. I paused too. The forest waited. The snow waited. I could feel it all around me. A presence. Patient and patient. Waiting for me to step again. I walked slowly. Every step a careful whisper. The prints followed, matching me exactly. A dance I could not break. The fog swallowed the lodge completely. Nothing remained but white silence. The footprints continued, and for a long moment, I wondered if I would ever be alone again. Then the path opened slightly, a small rise in the snow. I stopped, listened, and nothing. No crunching, no echo. Just my breath, soft and trembling, fading into the quiet. I moved forward again. The prints behind me were gone, but the memory of them lingered, cold, heavy, and waiting. The lodge was quiet. Snow pressed against the walls outside, muffling the world. My boots whispered across the wooden floor. I followed a narrow corridor, dimly lit by the pale moonlight through the cracks. The air smelled, faintly of damp wood and something colder, metal-like. I shivered. A door caught my eye. Not locked, but sealed in a strange way. The edges pressed tight, frost forming where the wood met the frame. I touched it. The surface was ice cold, biting through my glove. A faint hum seemed to vibrate from inside, soft and steady, like slow breathing. I leaned closer. Moonlight leaked through the cracks, spilling like water across the floor. And then I saw it. A shadow. Still watching. It didn't move like a person. It pressed against the darkness of the room as if waiting for something. I stepped back. The floor creaked under my weight, echoing like a warning. The lodge smelled colder here, heavier. The air clung to my skin, damp, sharp. I pressed my ear against the door. Silence. Then, a faint rustle. Slow, deliberate. As if the shadow was shifting, stretching just out of reach. I tried the handle. It didn't budge. The frost bit at my fingers. The hum persisted, steady and deep, vibrating through the wood, through me. I circled the door. The walls were too close, pressing inward. No windows. No escape from the feeling of being watched. Every step echoed off the tight walls. The shadow stayed. I caught glimpses through the thin cracks. Movement that shouldn't exist. A hand, or the suggestion of one. Pulling back, retreating into the dark. The silence inside the room was thick. I held my breath. Felt it in my chest. The lodge seemed to lean closer, watching, waiting. I pressed my palm to the frost. It was cold enough to sting, leaving marks on my skin. The hum grew slightly louder in response to my touch, a pulse beneath the wood. I imagined opening the door. A rush of icy air, the scent of old iron, something wet and still. But the door wouldn't move. The shadow lingered. I stepped away. The corridor stretched in dim lines, pale moonlight glancing off frost. I could still feel the room behind me, watching. The lodge creaked, soft, deliberate. I felt eyes in the dark corners, following every step. I kept walking. The frost on the walls faded into the ordinary cold of the lodge. But the memory of the room, the cold, the sealed edges, the watching shadow, stayed with me. Even now, when the world feels quiet, I imagine that room and the shadow waiting behind the door with no windows. The lodge was quiet tonight. Snow pressed against the windows, soft and thick. The air smelled of damp wood and frost. I noticed it in the corner, an old mirror leaning against the wall. Its surface was frosted over, opaque like a frozen breath. I stepped closer. My reflection was hidden beneath ice-white streaks. The wood floor was cold beneath my boots. The hum of the lodge vibrated faintly, pressing against my chest. Curiosity pushed me. I wiped the frost with my glove. Slowly. The glass cleared. Everything reflected perfectly. The lodge, pale moonlight spilling across the floor, the frost on the walls. But then I saw it. A tall man standing behind me, faceless, motionless. He wasn't there when I turned. But the mirror insisted he was. I froze. The glove trembled against the glass. The air grew colder. Faint rustling echoed from the corners of the room. I blinked. The reflection didn't change. The man stayed, watching, patient. I turned slowly. Nothing. Just the empty room. Just my own shadow stretching across the floor. I looked back at the mirror. He remained. Tall, faceless, silent. The frost around the edges seemed to shimmer, like the glass itself was alive. I stepped back. The wooden floor creaked beneath my boots. The air felt thicker, tighter. My breath formed clouds that clung and hung in the cold. I tried to convince myself it was imagination. A trick of the moonlight, the frost, the shadows. But imagination doesn't cast footprints in the reflection. It doesn't stand faceless. Behind you. The hum in the room grew, soft, low, vibrating through the floor. I pressed my palms to my chest, trying to steady myself. The mirror glowed faintly in the pale moonlight, insisting. I couldn't move. I wanted to, but the air seemed to press against my shoulders. Heavy, damp, cold. The shadow shifted slightly. Or maybe I imagined it. It didn't blink. It didn't breathe. It simply existed. I stepped forward, daring to look closer. The glass felt cold under my fingertips. Smooth, almost liquid. The reflection was perfect. Except for him, I leaned in. His head tilted just slightly. No face, no features. Just the dark, endless emptiness where a face should be. I turned again. The room was still, empty, silent. The mirror hummed faintly. The frost edges glimmered. The cold bit at my hands. I could feel the presence, patient, just behind me. I stepped back. The reflection followed. He followed. Faceless, tall, eternal. I left the mirror leaning there. I walked toward the far side of the lodge. Snow pressed against the walls, soft and heavy. The hum faded, leaving only the echo of my own breath. But even now, I feel him. Standing behind me, watching, faceless. The lodge was quiet. Snow pressed against the windows, soft and thick. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and frost. I noticed the radio first. Dusty, old, perched on a crooked shelf. Its dial wavered slightly, humming beneath the stillness. I reached for it. The metal was cold beneath my fingers. A soft vibration ran through the shelf. The hum deepened, static. At first, harmless. A whisper curling through the hiss. My name. I paused. The air shifted around me, tight and still. Frost on the walls glimmered in pale moonlight. I turned the dial. The whispers returned. Closer, soft, insistent. My name again, over and over, like a finger tracing my spine. The hum grew louder. The static thickened, curling like smoke. I pressed my hand against the radio. Cold, almost alive. The hum vibrated through the floor, through my bones. The whispers became breathing. Heavy, steady, rising behind me, though no one was there. I tried to step away. The lodge seemed smaller. The shadows pressed closer. The frost clung to my hair and skin. I turned toward the radio again. The static shifted, weaving words between the hiss. I could almost see the shapes of them, curling in the pale light, shapes that wanted to pull me in. The hum pressed at my chest. Breathing behind me grew louder. I wanted to move, but the air seemed thicker, heavier with each step. I leaned close. The radio's surface was smooth, almost wet beneath my glove. The words whispered, soft and ragged. Always my name. Always there. I stepped back, pressing palms to the walls. The frost bit my skin. The shadows flickered and stretched. Static hissed in waves like wind through hollow wood. I could feel it in the lodge. The air, the floor, the walls, all vibrating with it. Watching, waiting. The breathing grew louder, merging with the static. Each exhale pressed against me, cold, damp, impossible to ignore. I pressed my fingers to my ears. The hum persisted. I turned, hoping for silence. The radio sat still, but the whispers didn't stop. Breath, heavy, deliberate. Following me, I stepped away again. The snow outside seemed softer, quieter than before. But inside, the radio remained. Its hum, its static, its whispering breath, all calling my name. I left it on the shelf, cold, dusty, humming softly. The lodge settled into quiet again. But I could still feel it. The radio would wait, and so would the whispers. Soft, patient, calling. The lodge was quiet. Snow pressed against the roof, soft and thick. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and old pine. I noticed the attic door that night. It was always locked from the outside. But now, it creaked open by itself. I froze. The hinges whispered as they moved, slow and deliberate. Darkness stretched beyond the threshold, deep and endless. I stepped closer. The wood beneath my hand was cold, rough. A faint hum seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The air above carried a colder scent, a sharp metallic tang like rust or old iron. I climbed the stairs slowly. Each step creaked, small and uneven, echoing into the dark. The attic stretched before me. Shadows pooled in corners. Nothing moved, yet. The space felt alive. Soft scratching began. All around me. Not steady, but teasing. Almost deliberate, I turned, searching the darkness. The rafters, the floorboards, the shadows, empty. Yet the scratching persisted. Light as a whisper, just beyond the reach of my eyes. I paused, pressing my palms to my knees. The wood under my fingers was icy. My breath hung in the air, thick and slow. The attic seemed to hum with patience. I reached the center. The scratches circled me. Soft, careful, impossible to locate. A gust of cold air pressed against my face. I shivered. The scent of old pine and something damp, like soil, clung to the rafters. I leaned against the wall, listening. The silence between scratches felt heavier than the noise itself. Every creak of the wood sounded like a warning. I imagined leaving. The stairs. Slippery in my mind. Each step down might echo forever in the attic's shadows. But curiosity, or something darker, kept me rooted. The scratching slowed. A pause. Then a soft shift, faint as breath. I turned. Nothing. The attic was still, empty, silent. And yet regret pressed at my chest. I backed toward the stairs. Cold pressed against my shoulders. Shadows lingered at the edges of vision. Every step downward felt like leaving a part of myself behind. I reached the threshold. The door closed gently behind me. The hinges whispered once, then stillness. The lodge settled into quiet again. Snow muffled the world outside, but I could still feel the attic dark, patient, and waiting. The night pressed cold against the lodge. Snow clung to the roof in thick layers. The air smelled faintly of ice and wood smoke. I noticed the frost first, soft patterns curling across the window pane. Delicate, like frozen lace, then handprints, small, pale, pressed against the glass. I touched the cold surface. Smooth, icy, impossibly cold. The next evening they were larger. Longer fingers, stretching unnaturally. The frost seemed to breathe, pulsing slowly beneath my fingertips. I watched them grow. Night after night, shadows in the corners of the window shifting as the shapes expanded. The air inside smelled sharper now. Like wet stone and pine needles pressed into snow. My breath fogged the glass. It mingled with the frost, tracing lines that vanished too quickly. The handprints were no longer human, elongated, twisted, clawing at the glass with frozen desperation. And I couldn't look away. I pressed my palm against the window. The frost bit through my glove. A hum vibrated faintly in the air. The lodge felt smaller, enclosed, like the walls themselves were breathing. At night, I swore I felt fingers brush the pane, soft, impossible touches. Rustling that wasn't wind, shadows flickering across the room, just at the edge of vision. The shapes grew, curling across the frost like vines. I could see nothing of the world outside, only pale, frozen hands reaching, stretching, waiting. I tried to sleep, but the cold pressed at my skin seeped under the blankets. Every shift of the wind made the frost tremble. Every creak of the lodge sounded like a whispered warning. The windows seemed alive, watching me, the frost swirling into impossible shapes. Some nights I thought I saw eyes within the ice. I touched the glass again, shivering, breath forming thick clouds that clung to my face. The patterns pulsed under my hand. The cold seemed to seep into my bones. I backed away. The frost retreated slightly, curling at the edges. But I knew it would grow again. Each night larger, colder, more alive, I could feel isolation in the air. The lodge, the snow, the dark outside, all pressing in. I was alone, and the frozen hands were waiting. Even now, when the windows are silent, I feel them. Cold against the glass, watching, growing. The snow lay thick around the cabin. The night was still. Cold pressed against the walls, silent and heavy. I saw it first through the frost, a figure motionless, standing outside. The snow piled around its feet. It didn't move. It didn't knock, but it was there. I watched from inside. The air smelled of wood smoke and frozen pine. My breath fogged in the cold light of the lantern. Night after night it was closer, not in sudden leaps, not in sound, but slowly. Deliberately, I stepped toward the window. The frost bit at my fingers. The figure remained, pale against the snow, silent, patient. I tried to leave. But the snow outside seemed endless. The cabin walls pressed in with every heartbeat. The figure did not move, yet it was always there, always closer. I could feel it in the quiet, the snow crunching faintly under something unseen, the shadows stretching long across the cabin floor. I lit a fire. Warmth spread across the room. The air smelled of charred pine. The figure remained, frozen, watching. I drew the curtains, hoping to hide, to escape its gaze. But the edges of the glass revealed it anyway. Closer than before, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin felt like its approach. Every gust of wind whispered its presence. The frost outside glimmered like pale fingers reaching. I tried to imagine it gone, but the snow outside told me otherwise. Tracks, faint and indistinct, pressed closer each night. I stood by the window, frozen with it, its shape unwavering, the cold pressing against my face through the glass. Silent, patient. I lit another lantern. The figure remained, closer, always closer. I whispered my own name into the quiet. No answer. Only the snow, only the wind, only the faint, unblinking shape outside. I felt helpless. The cabin felt smaller, the snow deeper, the night endless. And still the figure waited, motionless, outside, even now. When the night is calm, I imagine it there, watching, waiting, closer than it should be. The night pressed against the lodge. Snow piled thick on the roof, silent and heavy. The air smelled faintly of pine and cold wood. I woke to whispers, soft, curling through the wooden hallways. They were familiar, but wrong. I thought I recognized the voices. Loved ones calling, but stretched, warped, distorted, as if the walls themselves spoke through them. I sat up. The blankets were damp from sweat. My breath formed clouds in the cold air. The hall stretched long and empty beyond my door. The whispers grew, soft, deliberate. Faint creaks accompanied them. Wood shifting, settling, listening. I rose carefully. The floor felt icy beneath my bare feet. Every step echoed, swallowed immediately by the hum of the lodge. The voices pressed closer. Names I knew, twisted, calling, laughing softly, begging silently. I pressed my hands over my ears. A shadow passed at the end of the hallway. I blinked. Nothing moved. The whispers lingered, curling in the corners. I touched the wall. Cold, damp, rough beneath my fingertips. The hum of the house vibrated faintly through the wood. The whispers followed the grain, sliding along the boards. I tried to leave the room, but every step forward stretched the voices. They were everywhere, surrounding me, echoing off the walls. I paused. The air smelled of old pine, rust, and something sweet I couldn't place. The whispers softened, almost patient, almost comforting, almost real. I dared to move again. Each step measured. The hallway seemed longer than it should. Shadows flickered just out of reach. The voices pressed against the edges of my mind. Familiar names, familiar tones, but wrong, distorted. I leaned against the wall. Frost pressed faintly against the window at the end of the hall. The cold seeped in, biting my fingers and cheeks. The whispers faded slowly, curling back into the wood. I exhaled, shivering. The hall returned to silence, but the feeling remained. Watching, patient. Even now, when the lodge sleeps, I hear fragments of the voices. Soft, distant, impossible to follow. Calling me from behind the walls. The night was heavy. Fog clung to the cabin, thick and damp. The air smelled of wet pine and frozen earth. I stepped outside. The snow pressed softly beneath my boots. The fog swallowed everything beyond a few feet. A shape appeared, tall, dark, and still. It stood far off, shrouded in pale haze. I blinked, and it was closer. Closer than before, though I hadn't moved. I stopped. The cold bit through my gloves. My breath hung in the fog, thick and slow. The shape remained silent, motionless, patient. The snow around it shimmered faintly, untouched. I blinked again. Closer still. The fog seemed to bend around it, carrying a faint hum. I wanted to run, but the ground felt heavy, the snow sticky beneath my feet. Each step forward pressed the fog tighter around me. The silhouette towered now, looming through the mist. I could feel it in my chest. A cold pressure, subtle but undeniable. The cabin behind me disappeared. Lost in the fog, the snow underfoot was pale, featureless. Only the shadow remained. I tried to speak. My voice caught in my throat. The fog swallowed it instantly. Every blink brought it closer. Every breath pressed cold against my face. I could smell the damp frost on its edges. I could feel it in my bones. The air seemed to vibrate, low and steady. I stepped backward, unsure where to go. The snow shifted under my boots, soft, almost alive. I wanted to hide, to vanish into the fog, but it moved with me, patient, silent, towering. I stopped again. The mist wrapped around my legs, pressing softly like hands I couldn't see. The shape froze in the pale haze. I blinked once more. Closer still. The snow beneath it untouched, the fog folding around it. I turned back toward the cabin. It felt impossibly far. The fog thickened, white and dense, hiding everything familiar. The shape did not move. And yet each time I blinked, it was closer, waiting, patient. I breathed slowly. The cold pressed against my cheeks. The night was silent, save for the soft hum in the fog. I stepped forward cautiously. The snow held my weight, cold and firm. The shadow. Closer. I reached the cabin door. Safe for now, but I could still see it through the pale haze. Still, approaching. Even now, when the fog lifts, I remember the shape. Tall. Silent. Closer than I thought possible. The lodge smelled of pine and dust. The fire had died to embers. Cold pressed against the walls and windows. I noticed the painting first. A family standing stiffly in the living room. Their faces calm, almost too perfect. By morning, frost had spread across the canvas. Delicate patterns curling over the edges. I pressed a finger to the glass. Cold, rough, biting the skin. I watched. Slowly, shadows began to stretch behind the figures. Thin, long, reaching toward the corners of the room. The air smelled sharper now. Ice and something faintly metallic. The shadows swayed, though the figures remained still. I stepped back. The floorboards creaked beneath my boots. The frost glimmered in the pale morning light. The shadows seemed to ripple, almost alive. I leaned closer. The family's eyes felt hollow. The shapes behind them twisted slightly, merging with the frost. Each breath I took condensed, clouding the glass. The room hummed softly. The frost edges glimmered, sharp as ice. I pressed a hand to my chest, shivering. The shadows stretched farther, curling toward me. I tried to convince myself it was imagination, but the frost whispered across the canvas. Tiny cracks formed where the shadows clung. The air seemed heavier, cold pressing at my skin. I stepped back again. The firelight flickered across the painting. The shadows moved with it, elongating. A subtle rustling filled the silent room, though no one else was there. I exhaled slowly. The frost was thickening. The shadows stretching, merging, almost reaching beyond the frame. I felt eyes on me, cold, patient, waiting. I could smell damp pine and frozen air. The room felt smaller. The lodge itself seemed to lean closer, listening. The painting held me in its gaze. I touched the glass once more. The frost bit my fingers. The shapes behind the family shifted, curling closer to the edge. I stepped back quickly. The morning light grew pale, slipping through the windows. The frost began to thin slightly at the edges, but the shadows remained. Long, quiet, patient. I left the painting where it hung. I walked across the lodge. The cold followed me. The shadows waited behind the canvas. Even now, when the lodge is still, I think of the frost spreading across the painting, of the shadows curling, stretching slowly, always watching. The room smelled of cold wood and lingering smoke. The windows were frosted over. Night pressed heavy against the walls. I noticed it first beneath the bed. The wooden plank shifted, rising and falling, slow and steady, like someone breathing, small and patient. I leaned closer. The floor was icy beneath my fingers. A faint hum seemed to vibrate through the boards. I lay back down. The breathing continued, soft, deliberate. Measuring its rhythm against mine, I could feel it in the air. The warmth of the blankets pressed to my skin. The cold beneath the bed tugging at my toes. A subtle, steady pressure beneath the planks. I held my breath. The planks rose again. The air smelled faintly metallic, damp, like wet earth. The bed frame creaked with every inhalation. I tried to ignore it, but the movement persisted. Slow, intimate, close enough to feel in my chest. I reached my hand toward the floor. The wood was icy, vibrating slightly under my touch. A rustling followed, soft, deliberate, almost like whispered breath. I couldn't move. The air pressed against my face. The bed seemed smaller, the room heavier. I closed my eyes. The planks beneath rose and fell, measured, patient, almost alive. I could smell the cold, hear the faint hum beneath the wood. I thought of leaving, but the movement didn't stop. It lingered beneath me, patient, watching. I pressed my palms against the blankets. The cold seeped through. The floor rose again, faintly trembling beneath the bed frame. Every breath I took matched it unwillingly. I wanted to speak, to call it out. But my voice stayed in my throat. The night stretched long. I could feel it in every creak, every soft vibration, every whisper in the wood. The bed beneath me, alive, breathing. Morning came slowly. The air warmed, the frost melting at the edges. The planks beneath the bed were still, but I could feel it, waiting. Even now, when the room is quiet, I imagine it beneath the floorboards, rising and falling, soft, patient, breathing. The basement smelled of damp wood and rust. Cold pressed against my skin. Shadows pooled in the corners, thick and still. I noticed it in the far corner. A heavy trunk. Bound with chains, black and cold, the floorboards creaked beneath my boots. Dust floated in pale light from the single bulb overhead. I could smell mildew, faint and sour, hanging in the air. I knelt slowly. The chains were thick, tight, immovable. And then I heard it. Knocks. Faint. Soft. Coming from inside. I froze. The air felt heavier, pressing against my chest. Every breath I took hung in the cold. The knocks came again. Steady, deliberate. Measured as if counting each second, I leaned closer. The trunk was icy under my hands. I could feel the vibration of the knocks through the wood. The basement seemed to shrink. The shadows pressed closer. The hum of the building deepened, low and subtle. The knocks paused, and I held my breath. A faint rustle followed. The trunk shifted slightly. The chains rattled softly. I felt the air move against my face, cold and damp. I stepped back. The knocks resumed. Closer now. Urgent, patient, restrained. I pressed my hand against the wall. The wood was icy, rough. The hum underfoot thrummed gently, echoing in my bones. I wanted to leave, but curiosity held me there. The knocks slowed, almost deliberate, teasing. Soft, restrained, unyielding. I knelt again. My breath fogged in the cold light. I could smell the faint iron of the chains. The trunk seemed alive, patient, aware. The knocks softened to a whispering rhythm, almost like a heartbeat beneath the boards. I imagined eyes inside the dark wood, watching, waiting. I stepped back slowly. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift with each breath. The hum in the air vibrated faintly against my chest. I left the trunk where it was. The knocks continued, slow and deliberate. I could hear them echo in the walls long after I left the basement. Even now in the quiet, I imagine it there. The chains tight, the trunk waiting, knocking. The lodge smelled of cold timber and lingering smoke. The windows were frosted over. Night pressed heavy against the walls. I noticed the staircase first. It led upward, wooden steps dark and smooth. But it ended abruptly at a wall. The air was still. I could feel the cold pressing through the floorboards. A faint hum seemed to vibrate under the soles of my boots. Some nights I swear I hear footsteps, soft, careful, deliberate. Climbing the staircase one by one, I froze. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp wood. The shadows at the base of the steps shifted subtly. The steps creaked as if someone were there. Pausing, at the top, I listened. My breath hung in the cold air. The hum beneath my feet deepened. The footsteps repeated. Slow, careful. Stopping just at the wall, I wanted to climb. But the staircase ended abruptly. The wall was blank, pale under the lantern light. I pressed my hand to it. Cold, smooth. The wood beneath the floorboards vibrated faintly, as though echoing the steps above. The shadows shifted again. The air pressed against my face. A faint rustling followed, soft, deliberate, almost alive. I stepped back slowly. The staircase remained empty, silent. Yet the hum lingered. I watched the top. Every night I swear the footsteps come, climbing carefully, stopping at the wall. The room felt smaller, the ceiling lower, the walls leaning in with each soft step. I breathed slowly. The cold pressed against my skin. The hum beneath my feet continued, almost patient, almost knowing. I could smell the damp timber, faint smoke, and frost at the edges of the room. The steps remained still now, but I knew somewhere above the staircase waits. The footsteps, patient. Even now, when the lodge is quiet, I imagine them. Climbing, stopping, waiting, the air smelled sharp, cold and clean with frost clinging to my eyelashes. The frozen lake stretched pale and silent before me. I stepped onto the ice. It groaned faintly beneath my weight. Snow crunched softly with each careful step. And then I noticed them. Eyes. Faint, pale, just beneath the surface. They followed me, slowly, patiently, tracking my every movement. The ice reflected the moonlight, silver, brittle, fragile beneath my boots. I could see my breath fog the air, and still the eyes, staring. I knelt, pressing a hand to the frozen surface. Cold bit through my glove. The eyes remained, unblinking, waiting. A faint ripple shimmered through the ice, not from wind, not from the snow. Something beneath, moving just enough to notice me. I stood again, heart slow and deliberate. The eyes didn't vanish. They followed me across the pale, frozen expanse. The air smelled of ice and damp pine. Each step pressed a soft echo into the frozen lake. The eyes tracked it, patient, silent, unyielding. I wanted to turn back, but the path behind me seemed endless, swallowed by fog. The lake stretched, still and frozen. The eyes, waiting. I breathed slowly, listening to the hum of cold, a subtle vibration beneath my boots, like the ice itself was aware of me. I knelt once more, close enough to see faint shadows beneath the eyes, long curling shapes stretching through the frozen water. They didn't move, but the feeling of them pressed against me. I pressed my palm to the ice again. The cold seeped into my bones. The eyes remained, watching, patient. I stood slowly, careful not to disturb the ice. The snow crunched softly. The fog swirled at the edges of my vision. The eyes followed, every step mirrored beneath the frozen surface. Even now, when I close my eyes, I see them beneath the ice, silent, patient, always, watching. The room smelled faintly of wax and cold air. Shadows stretched long across the wooden floor. The windows were frosted, pale light pressing in from outside. A candle burned on the table. Small, steady, and defiant. No matter how hard I tried, it wouldn't go out. I pinched the flame. It flickered, then returned, brighter. The air smelled faintly of smoke and pine. I could feel the cold seeping through the floorboards. The candle's light cast two shadows. Impossible. One moved with me. The other stayed just behind. I leaned closer. The flame shimmered, warm on my face. The second shadow lingered, stretching across the wall, static in the edges of my vision. I blew, softly at first, then harder. The candle refused. The flame danced defiantly. The second shadow remained. I stepped back. The air felt thick, heavy with wax and quiet pressure. The flame pulsed. The shadows shifted ever so slightly. I touched the candle. The wax was warm, strangely alive beneath my fingers. The second shadow stretched toward me, but it did not move the way shadows should. I whispered to the flame, soft, hesitant. The candle flickered again, but refused to die. The second shadow, unwavering. I turned the room over in my mind, every corner filled with the pale, impossible light. The air hummed faintly. The shadows seemed to breathe in the silence. I tried snuffing it with my hand. The wax melted under my fingers. The flame rose again. The second shadow mirrored it. Defiant. Patient. I stepped away from the table. The room smelled of smoke and frost. The candle burned. The shadow stretched across the walls, perfectly still behind me. I could hear nothing but the faint hum of heat from the candle. The impossible shadow pressed quietly against the edges of the room. Even now, when the air is still, I imagine the flame burning, patient, unyielding, and the second shadow, always just behind. The room smelled faintly of dust and cold wood. Moonlight pressed pale across the floorboards. The windows shivered with the wind outside. Late at night it began, scratching, soft, hesitant, then deliberate. It moved across the ceiling, circling slowly at first. Each night it grew faster. I lay still. My breath hung in the cold air. The wood beneath me seemed to pulse with the scratches. The smell of aged timber and faint mildew clung to the air. Each circle traced above me, restless, patient. A hum of tension vibrated faintly in the room. I wanted to leave. But my body refused. The scratching continued, relentless. I listened closely. It shifted from corner to corner. A rhythm forming, always circling. I could feel the ceiling's vibration. Soft, uneven. It pressed against the walls, pressing against me. The air grew colder. The shadows at the edges of the room deepened. The scratches quickened. Faster. I pressed my palm to the floor. Cold seeped into my skin. The hum underfoot mirrored the scratching above. Restless, alive. I imagined something moving just beyond the plaster. Something patient. Something waiting. The scratches continued. Circling. Faster now. Filling the room with silent insistence, I held my breath. The smell of wood and dust was strong in my nose. My ears caught every faint shift, every subtle scrape, and then a pause. The room held its breath with me. The scratches slowed. A single faint tap lingered above. I dared not move. The shadows seemed heavier, pressing closer. The cold pressed against my face. Even now, when the night is still, I imagine it circling. Above me, patient, relentless. The hallway smelled faintly of pine and dust. Moonlight pressed pale stripes across the floor. The air was cold, still, almost listening. The bedroom door remained locked. All day it sat there, silent, inaccessible. At night, I heard it. Soft, muffled sobs, faint. Coming from within, I pressed my ear to the door. The wood was cold against my cheek. The sobs trembled, almost human, almost familiar. I stepped back. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight. The air smelled faintly of damp linen and shadow. Night after night, the sobs continued. Soft, hesitant, fragile, as though someone or something was trapped inside. One night I found the key. Cold metal pressed into my palm. I trembled as I fitted into the lock. The door gave way with a slow creak. A gust of cold air escaped. The sobs vanished. The room was empty. Only a chair faced the window. Silent. Lonely. Moonlight fell across the floorboards, silver and pale. The chair didn't move. Yet somehow, it felt heavy, weighted with sorrow. I breathed slowly. The air smelled of old wood and frost. The silence pressed against me, patient and unwavering. I stepped closer. The chair seemed waiting. I could almost imagine a figure sitting there. Small, hunched, sorrowful. The window showed the frozen landscape outside. Snow lay heavy against the branches. The moonlight traced shadows across the room. The chair remained alone. I wanted to leave. But my feet refused. The air held me, quiet and cold. Even now I can hear it. A faint echo of sobs in the empty space. Faint, as if the room itself remembers. The chair still faces the window. Silent. Waiting. Lonely. The lodge was quiet. Snow pressed against the windows. The wooden beams smelled faintly of cold and old pine. I spoke. Just a word. A simple word. It returned. Soft, delayed, but wrong. The air shivered around me. The floorboards hummed faintly beneath my feet. A chill moved across my skin. I tried again. A full sentence this time. The lodge repeated it. But one word twisted. Wrong. Unfamiliar. I held my breath. The walls seemed to listen. The shadows shifted against the corners. The echoes followed, patient and deliberate. I whispered my own name. The lodge said something else. A small tremor ran down my spine. The sound of my voice, but not mine. I stepped closer to the hearth. Cold radiated from the stone. The faint hum in the room pulsed with my heartbeat. Each word I spoke returned altered. Sometimes subtle, sometimes cruel. A mirror of my speech. But fractured, I pressed my palms to the table. The wood was rough, splintering beneath my fingers. The lodge whispered back. twisting what I had said. The echo always lagged. The echo was never right. I tried silence. But the lodge filled it anyway. Soft murmurs like my own voice, lingering just beyond comprehension. The air smelled of frost and timber. The shadows leaned closer. Even the faint hum beneath the floor seemed aware of me. I spoke again. The word came slowly. The echo returned. Wrong. Always wrong. A creeping dread filled me. Not fear exactly. Something else. Unease. A sense that I had become less certain of who I was. I stopped moving, listening. The lodge breathed with me. The shadows breathed with me. Even when I closed my eyes, the wrong words repeated inside my mind. A slow, endless cycle. An echo I could not escape. The silence finally returned. But it was hollow, weighted with what had been. A voice. Mine, yet not. The lodge was quiet. A cold draft brushed across my neck. Frost gathered on the window pane, soft and pale. The clock hung on the wall, ticking backward. Slow, deliberate, impossible. I watched it, each second unwinding. The hands crawling toward midnight. The floor beneath me creaked with a whisper. A rustling in the corner. Shadows stretched, longer than they should have been. Midnight arrived. The tick stopped. Time froze, and the shadows moved. Not with me, not with any breeze, alone. They slid across the walls, curling, leaning, shifting silently. I touched the wooden banister. It was ice cold. The faint hum of the lodge seemed to pause with my breath. The shadows circled the room, soft footsteps without weight. Cold air clung to my skin. The smell of old pine and frost deepened. I stepped closer to the clock. The hands were frozen, pointing straight at 12. The air trembled around them. My reflection in the window seemed delayed, trailing behind my movement. The shadows flickered against the walls. An arm stretched where none should have been. A shape crouched, unseen yet palpable. I could feel it pressing against the edges of the room. I exhaled slowly. The silence pressed into my ears. The cold settled into my bones. Every breath seemed measured by the frozen hands above. Time remained halted. The lodge's shadows were alive. Not human, not quite, but aware. I moved my hand. The shadows recoiled just slightly, then resumed their slow, deliberate dance. The room smelled faintly of metal, of snow packed tight outside. The hum of the walls thrummed beneath my feet. I spoke. Only a whisper. The shadows shivered. They didn't answer, but they leaned closer. Minutes passed, though they didn't. The frozen clock held them there, suspended, restless, waiting. Finally, the first tick returned, a sound so sharp in the frozen silence. The shadows shivered again, then stilled. Time resumed. The hands moved forward, but the memory of their backward crawl remained. The lodge seemed heavier now, as if it remembered what had happened. I turned away from the clock. The frost on the windows melted slightly in the weak light. But the shadows? Some lingered longer than they should. Stretching, watching, patient. I took a breath. The air was thick, cold, alive with waiting. The tick of the clock filled the lodge, but the echoes of frozen time whispered still. The hallway was quiet. Shadows pooled along the floorboards. Frost pressed against the window, thin and pale. A locked door stood ahead. Its wood was cold beneath my fingers. I paused, listening. Only the hum of the wind outside. The keyhole stared at me, a small circle of darkness. I bent closer, and then an eye, wide, unblinking. Staring back at me, it wasn't my own reflection. The air thickened, heavy with the smell of old wood and damp stone. The hum of the lodge seemed to deepen. My breath caught. I pulled back slightly. The door led to a room. Empty. Nothing moved. No furniture, no shadow, no warmth. The eye lingered, peering through the keyhole, unafraid. Soft, subtle movements in the periphery of my vision. A draft brushing my neck, almost a whisper. I leaned closer again. The wood was icy under my cheek. Faint rustling inside the empty room. A soft groan as if the air itself were breathing. The eye didn't blink. It followed me. Even as I stepped back, my footsteps muffled on the floorboards. The smell of frost mixed with something metallic faint, lingering. I pressed my ear against the door. The room remained silent. No footfalls, no movement. Yet the feeling of being watched pressed against my skin. I straightened. The keyhole seemed darker now, the eye closer. Impossible. The door hadn't moved, I whispered. Nothing returned my words. Only the silence, thick and heavy. The shadow beneath the door stretched slightly. The hallway seemed narrower. The frost outside shimmered in the pale light. My heart thumped against my ribs. Soft, deliberate, like a second heartbeat in the walls. The eye vanished. Or maybe it never left. The keyhole was empty. The room remained bare. I stepped back. Fingers cold, brushing the doorknob. The smell of damp wood lingered. A faint static in the air like distant voices I couldn't hear. The door stood locked, silent, watching. And I was left alone with the memory of that gaze. A breath, shallow. The hallway stretched on. The lodge held its quiet unbroken, and the eye waited, patient, beyond the wood. The forest pressed close around me. Branches scratched my arms. The fog lay heavy, wet against my skin. I walked further than I had before, the crunch of frozen leaves underfoot, a hum of wind through the bare trees, and then a cabin. It rose from the mist, pale and familiar. The same shape, the same creaking roof. I stopped. The air smelled of smoke, though no fire burned. A soft draft rustled the fog across the ground. The windows reflected pale light, but there was no sun. The door. I pushed it open slowly. Inside, everything was exactly as my own cabin had been. The table, the chairs, the floorboards that groaned under my weight. But the fireplace. I froze. A tall shadow leaned there, still, watching. The heat was gone. The smell of soot replaced by cold stone. I stepped closer. My footsteps echoed softly. The shadow did not move. I reached the edge of the hearth. It was impossibly tall, stretching beyond the ceiling, yet contained within the firebox. The shape was featureless, silent, heavy. I could feel its weight pressing into my chest. I tried to breathe slowly. The air smelled faintly of smoke and something else. Something wet, like frost melting into dirt. My fingers brushed the mantel. It was cold as ice. The shadow stretched slightly when I shifted. Or maybe it was my imagination. The silence pressed against my ears. I could hear my own heartbeat thumping in rhythm with the floorboards. I leaned back toward the doorway. The cabin's light seemed dimmer. The fog outside thickened, curling in through the cracks, a rustle of movement in the corner of my eye. The shadow. It was taller than the walls, yet it did not leave the fireplace. It simply waited, patient. I wanted to leave. I wanted the forest to swallow me back into its mist. But the door, it was farther than I remembered stepping. The air itself seemed to resist my movement. I took a step back, and the shadow stretched slightly, just enough to touch the edge of my vision. A whisper? Or the wind pressing against the broken window? I could not tell. I closed the door slowly, one finger brushing the wood. The cabin lingered in the fog behind me, its shape impossible, yet familiar. I walked away. The forest swallowed my footprints quickly. But the memory of that fireplace and the tall, silent figure inside stayed with me. The fog seemed thicker now. Every rustle of the trees whispered a warning. And somewhere, far away, the soft hum of the cabin breathing. The morning light was pale and still. The air smelled faintly of cold wood and dust. I noticed the chair near the window had shifted. Just a little, but enough to make me pause. I touched the table. Its edge felt colder than yesterday. The rug was smoother, as if pressed down in a different pattern. I blinked. Everything seemed wrong. Night came. The fog outside pressed against the windows. I lay in bed, trying to ignore the rustling of the old boards. But sleep would not come, a soft, shifting sound. Closer this time, I opened my eyes. The bed. It was no longer against the wall. It had moved. To the center of the room. Surrounded by shadows that seemed to cling to the corners, I ran my hand across the floor. The cold pressed into my palm. A draft stirred the curtains. The smell of something old and wet lingered in the air. The walls seemed to breathe. A faint hum vibrated beneath the floorboards. The shadows. They stretched toward me, curling softly around the bedposts. Silent, patient, I tried to stand. My feet pressed against uneven floorboards. The rug had shifted too, brushing against my ankles like a whisper. I reached for the window. The glass was fogged from the cold outside. I could see my own reflection, pale and unsteady. But behind me, a shape lingered in the dark. The furniture continued its quiet dance. A chair slid closer. The dresser shifted slightly. Even the shelves leaned as if watching me. I lay back down. My breath made faint clouds in the cold air. The hum beneath the floor was louder now. I felt the shadows brush against my hands. The room was alive. Not with warmth, but with subtle intent. Every object seemed aware. Every shadow held patience. Every sound was deliberate. I closed my eyes. The hum became a whisper. The floorboards rose and fell gently beneath the bed. The shadows coiled closer. I felt them pressing into the edges of the room, stretching toward me. When I opened my eyes, the bed had not moved. Yet the room was different. The corners darker, the air colder, and the faint smell of something wet lingered, almost like breath. I could hear it then. Soft footsteps across the room, though nothing moved. A static whisper, almost a sigh. The furniture held its place, but the room itself shifted. I lay there alone, listening to the gentle hum and the soft weight of the shadows. The bed in the center of the room. The walls close and strange. The night endless. And when dawn finally crept through the fogged glass, everything had returned to its place. Except the memory. The knowledge that the room could change, even when I was awake. The air smelled faintly of frost and dust. I ran my fingers along the table, now back against the wall. The chair had returned near the window. But the shadows lingered just out of sight, and I knew the room would move again tonight. And I would be here, waiting, alone. The room was cold, though the fire still burned low. The air smelled faintly of wet wood and old smoke. I moved across the floor, and the shadow in the corner shifted. It was farther than yesterday, closer than I had ever noticed. Its outline vague at first, just a dark blur against the wall. But every night it edged nearer. I paused by the window. The frost pressed against the glass. I could see the fog outside curling like soft fingers. And behind me, the shadow stretched. I lifted my hand. It moved, not on its own, but as if it watched me, learning, mimicking. I stepped forward. The boards creaked beneath my weight. The shadow followed. Every movement I made, every breath, it copied. I turned quickly. Its form paused, then mirrored me perfectly, a pale echo of myself. And then it smiled. Not a mouth, just the suggestion of one dark and quiet. I tried to step backward. The air felt thicker, closer. The faint hum of the house became a low vibration. The shadow's edges sharpened, stretching like smoke in the corners. I froze, my own breath fogging the air. It mimicked the rise and fall of my chest. It was me, and not me. The walls seemed to lean inward. Every object became muted. Even the rug, the chair, the desk. They all receded into shadow. All that remained was the two of us, I whispered. My voice trembled. It repeated the words perfectly, except slightly wrong. Each echo distorted, mocking. I moved my fingers. The shadow flexed its shape like wet clay. Every gesture I made, every tilt of my head, it learned. I ran my hand along the floor. Cold pressed into my palm. A faint rustle beneath the boards answered me. The air smelled faintly of iron and frost. The shadow's outline sharpened against the wall, matching mine exactly. I tried to step aside. It mirrored me. I tried to turn, crouch, retreat. It copied each motion. I felt trapped in my own shape. Night deepened. The fire guttered. Its glow barely touched the corners. The shadow leaned forward, learning the spaces between my movements, filling them before I could. I pressed myself to the far wall. My heart drummed in slow, heavy beats. The boards creaked softly. The shadow loomed closer. Its edges like wet ink on the floorboards. I shivered. Cold ran along my spine. I could smell damp wood and old frost. And for the first time, I felt it breathe with me. I turned toward the corner. The shadow paused. Then perfectly, it mirrored the tilt of my head. I realized it wasn't just copying anymore. It was becoming me. The room held its breath. So did I. The quiet pressed against my ears, filling the spaces between heartbeats. The shadow's edges blended with mine until I couldn't tell where I ended. And it began. I backed away slowly, but each step felt heavier. The shadow followed, closer and closer, until finally it pressed against me. Not physical, but in a way that made the floor feel hollow beneath my feet. I whispered into the dark. The shadow answered, not as me, but as something shaped like me, something patient, waiting, learning. The fire hissed low. The air smelled of frost and old timber, and I understood. Tomorrow, tonight, whenever, the shadow would be ready. To move as I move, to be me, or something that used my shape to wait. And I could do nothing but breathe, alone, and mirrored. The night pressed against the windows. No wind, no rustling of the trees. The lodge itself had gone quiet. Even the boards under my feet seemed to hold their breath. The air smelled cold of wet timber and frost. Each inhale felt heavier than the last. I moved slowly. The fire had burned low, leaving only pale light flickering along the walls. The shadow man was nowhere, yet. I could feel the emptiness around me, pressing, waiting. I sat on the edge of the bed. The silence was thick. It wasn't peace. It was waiting. My own heartbeat echoed, loud in my ears. I could hear my breath, shallow and quick. And then, nothing else. Even the creaks of the lodge had stopped. I whispered a name. The sound barely left my lips. There was no echo, no answer. Just the silence stretching, folding over me. I rose slowly. The boards beneath my feet felt unusually solid, almost knowing. Every step I took, I imagined it reaching for me. And in the stillness, I could feel the shadow's patience. I looked up. The corner of the room was darker than before. The shadow man stepped forward. Not slowly, not quickly. But with the inevitability of night itself, the room felt smaller. The air colder. The smell of frost and old wood was stronger, clinging to my skin. I could see the edges of its form, darker than any shadow I had known. Its shape filled the room. I wanted to move. I wanted to speak. But even breathing felt loud, intrusive in the silence. The shadow leaned forward, stretching just enough to match my height. I could feel it in the room, in the air, in the way the cold seemed to hug my bones. I could sense it in the silence, patient, waiting. For the moment, I realized there was nowhere to hide. The fire guttered. Its light trembled across the walls. The shadow stayed perfectly still. And yet it was moving somehow, shifting with the corners of the room, filling every space I had once called mine. I sank to the floor. Cold pressed against my palms. The boards beneath me were steady, yet they seemed alive, holding the weight of the silence, the weight of its patience. I could feel it learning me now, every twitch, every shiver, every shallow breath. The shadow mirrored me, not as I was, but as I could be, filling the room, filling the lodge, filling the silence. I wanted light, fire, sound, anything. But the silence would not break. It held me, wrapped around me like fog, and the shadow's form pressed closer. I realized then fully, the lodge had not gone quiet by accident. It had waited. It had been patient, and now it claimed me. I stared at the dark. The shadow stepped closer. It filled the room entirely, and yet it was more than a shape. It was the absence of everything I thought I knew. I could feel the frost on the windows, the hum of still air, the weight of solitude pressing into my chest. And there in the silence I understood. This was final. There was no escape. No sound would return. No creak, no rustle, no wind. Only the shadow and me. The room grew colder. The fire almost vanished. The silence stretched beyond the walls, beyond the floorboards. It waited, and I could do nothing but breathe alone and watched as the shadow filled the lodge.